Good morning, everyone. This is our introduction to project budgets. My name is Sarah Rice. I am the Research and Knowledge Services Manager here at Forefront. And if you are having any difficulty hearing me or anything like that, please do call that out in the chat so we can try to address that. Now, for anyone who is not particularly familiar with Forefront, we are a statewide membership organization for nonprofits, grant makers, their advisors, and other members of the nonprofit sector. We provide education, such as these workshops, advocacy through some of our policy work, both at a state and federal level, and other kinds of facilitation for the entire sector. We want everybody to be able to gather kind of in one place to be able to affect change. Now, where the library falls into that, we are a special library, which means our collection is specialized, in our case, focusing on the nonprofit sector. We are also part of a network with an organization called Candid. That is how we have access to some of the training materials we use, like these slides, well, most of the slides for today's presentation, some of the databases we use for doing research, and other things of that nature. If you are not in the Chicago area, there are other libraries in Illinois who are also part of the same information network and thus can have access to some of the same databases and research. The last URL on this slide, the candid.org/findus, is where Candid has their map of all of the libraries and other kinds of institutions across the country who are part of this network and have access to some of these same resources that we do for nonprofit type research. Right, I mentioned that in part because here at Forefront, we are still working remotely. So unfortunately, I cannot invite any of you to come visit the library to do research with us in person. However, if you are affiliated with a member organization, if your organization is a member of Forefront, you can ask the library for remote research assistance. You can email us and ask us to kind of provide research for you. All right, so that takes care of my introduction. So we'll jump into the main topic for today. This training is designed to introduce the key elements of a project budget, equip everyone with some practical skills so that by the end of today's training, you should be able to describe all of the basic elements of a project budget, know how to estimate the expenses and income for a project, and follow up after a project is funded. If this were being done in person, there would also be a exercise that everyone would be doing because I'd be able to hand out a worksheet. We can't really do that as we go here in our virtual format, but I will be sending that out as an attachment afterwards in the next couple of days when we get everything wrapped up on the recording being finalized and everything. So there will be a follow-up email that should hopefully have a link to this recording, and we'll also have an attachment that will have the worksheet that would be kind of an exercise to go along with this presentation. All right, so the main things funders want to see in a project budget: the estimate of the true cost of the project. They want to know what they're getting into, so they want to know really what is it going to cost, and what your anticipated incomes are to meet those costs. This is incomes in the sense of all kinds of support that will help fund the project in question. Right, so the main components of a project budget are what you kind of see on this slide here. You can see we have basically kind of two columns that should hopefully balance out. The income for a project, what supports it, and the expenses, what it is going to cost to run it. Now, all grant makers are different. Some of them have their own budget formats. That is actually a conversation in the fundraise, the grant making kind of sphere about this, because that is generally one of those things that a lot of folks are not big fans of, are foundations that have their own unique specialized little forms that you have to fill out to tell them about your budget. So there is conversation and hopefully movement toward either streamlining or allowing organizations to be able to tell their budget story in the way that best works for the organization, rather than having specialized forms. But that is still definitely a thing that many grant makers have, where they have their own special grant budget forms. However, a lot of grant makers also simply want to see a one-page kind of summary of the financial projections, breaking down your project's income and expenses, both the direct ones and the indirect ones. So income, that is the support and revenue. This is made up of grants and contributions, all grants from foundations, corporates, sponsorships, government grants, donations from individuals, any other kind of contribution. We will be talking about all of these pieces in more detail as their slides come up. So this is just kind of a quick overview of what each of these pieces is. And the earned income. This is things that are generated by charging fees for services, selling items or goods, that sort of thing. On the other side of the scale, expenses, how much your project costs. Now, direct costs are directly related to the specific project, meaning these expenses are used for or allocated only to this project. That's why they're called direct costs. These include both personnel and non-personnel costs. Personnel, all staff directly involved in the project. Non-personnel, all other expenses that are directly related to this project. Now, under expenses, we also have indirect costs. That's overhead. We will definitely talk about that more in detail later on in this presentation. So these are the basic components. Now we've kind of gone over them. We're going to talk a little more about the process one goes through when you're developing a project budget. So the first thing is, who's working on it? Who's the best person to draft your project budget? Now, if you're at a very small organization, you may have a very limited pool of answers to that question. You might have, only a couple of staff, so it's, going to be you by default because that is who is there. But if you do have multiple people, the best person to start drafting your project budget is the person who knows the project best. Now, this often turns into a team effort where you're going to also have someone from fundraising or your financial side of things involved, so they can kind of speak to those areas of expertise. But you want to start with a person who is actually going to know what all of the pieces this project needs are. Two things to keep in mind with this. This is because your budget is a bit of a reflection of your proposal. This is a piece of your proposal, and it should basically be telling the same story, just with the price tags attached. So this is, when we talk about proposal writing, we'll often mention that different reviewers of proposals will start with different pieces of the proposal. Some people who review proposals start with the summary, the executive summary. Some jump straight into the narrative, and some will jump straight to the budget because they're very numbers-oriented people. And so you want these pieces to all be telling the same story. And this is one where if you go over all of the items, you should still be able to kind of see the shape of the project, even though there's not a lot that's narratively here about your particular project. Everything in your proposal should be represented in your budget. If you're talking about staff, if you're talking about space, anything you're going to be talking about in the proposal should show up in the budget to reflect either that it has been donated, that it is something your organization already has covered with your location, or that it is something you have considered on what it's going to cost and how that's going to work out for you. Who are all of the people working on the project? What are the supplies, the materials, the equipment that's needed? Right, so speaking of all of those things, those were expenses. We'll get into further detail, turning to the expense side of the budget itself. So how do you know how much a project costs? If it's a project you've implemented before, you're going to have a good idea. Now, costs can go up. So everybody who's tried to do any shopping in the last couple of years knows there can be supply chain issues and all kinds of things that can change how the expenses work there. So you still want to kind of check If it's been a while since you've done a budget for a particular project, you might even need to check in on inflation or, just simple changes in costs of things. If it's a brand new project, there's a general way to estimate your projected costs. When you're looking at the pieces involved, look at estimates. Get a couple of them, something like 3. You can do this either by generally internet searching. If you're looking to rent space, if you're looking to buy materials, these are things where you can check various companies, check various websites to see what they're charging for those. Sometimes for more specialized services, you might have to actually request a quote through a website or through a phone call. That's usually also the kind of free service a company is going to do, because they would like you to know how much you're spending with them. So you want to shop around, see if you have options, see who is providing some of these particular kinds of services or materials or equipment that you need for your project. You're going to collect and you're going to document each of these quotes, so you have a record of where you got your cost estimates. Especially if this is in kind of early stages, you want to be able to know exactly where you need to go back to actually obtain those services or materials or anything. If you collect these quotes and then decide, yes, we want to go with that number, you want to make sure you have good documentation for being able to contact them again, know who you talked to, if you had actually contacted someone for a quote, know if this, if you were counting on some sort of sale or deal or something where there's like a timeline. So documentation, very important every step of the way, specifically here, since this is an area where we are talking about money. And you're going to choose the estimate that is the most reasonable and appropriate for your project. This may not always be the lowest one. It's the one that makes the most sense. If you are looking at renting space, it might be that the one that is the lowest turns out to not really be large enough, or might be in an area that's, turns out to be very inaccessible, or something where the one that's in the middle is a much better fit for you. So looking at kind of details of these estimates and what they cover, even if they're promising kind of the same result, there are going to be details about it, like I said, location, accessibility, quality, other kinds of benefits or other sorts of things that might come with it, where you're wanting to choose the estimate that is the best fit. This might not necessarily, lowest bidder is often the lowest bidder for a reason. You want to make sure that that is still meeting all of your needs in those cases. We generally use the phrase reasonable, complete, and realistic. Those are the kinds of phrasings, the kinds of things to keep in mind when you're looking at kind of estimated costs and what kinds of costs you're wanting to be reflecting. All right, so the personnel side of things. This is one where you generally don't need to, collect estimates, because this is about your personnel, your staff. It is also one where you should, hopefully have a lot of the information fairly accessible to you. If you're not, this is, the area where you might need to talk to, a financial officer or something at your organization for them. Personnel costs are very likely to be the largest component of your budget. You need the right people to manage, to implement your project, to oversee things, to be able to have the project run smoothly. So you're going to list all of the employees who are working on the project. You are then going to estimate how much of their time is dedicated to that project. Like if it's your executive director, for example, they may only spend 10% of their time on this project. The program director might be focused 100% of their time on this project for a couple of months. So you're going to kind of think about how much of their job is going to be focused on this project. Then you'll need to know their annual salary or their hourly wages, depending on how your organization is structured there. And you'll calculate and allocate the portion of their salary the project is covering. For example, if your ED is spending 10% of her time on this project, and she makes 60 grand a year, we'll say, the amount that you would be putting in your budget for this line item would be $6,000. In addition to salaries, you should also include cost of benefits when you're looking at personnel. If your organization has health benefits, disability benefits, you also include a percentage of the employer's contribution for providing those benefits. Typically, your finance person is going to know what your fringe benefit rate is. So you can add that amount to your budget. Examples of kinds of things that are included to calculate fringe benefits and its rate include, like I said, disability benefits, employer portions of Social Security tax, health insurance, life insurance, pension plans, workers' comp, all of those sorts of things. Now, frequently, if you have a lot of questions about that sort of thing or a lot of issues doing it, there are a number of kind of fundraising or accounting related organizations who are happy to provide a bit of information about them. You can often search, calculate fringe benefit rate, and find some very useful articles about that sort of thing. This is also one where it can frequently be useful to do this at kind of an organization rate level, so that you can then have one rate that you are then using with all of your kinds of proposals here. If you kind of know what the general fringe benefit rate is for your organization, you can do that on that kind of level, unless you have different levels of employees who have very, very different fringe benefits, then you would probably need to look at your specific people. But there are a couple of different ways to do that. And that is one that, again, finance person at your organization, accounting type folks can help figure out if you have kind of detailed questions about that. So the salaries, your fringe benefit rate, you have that number so that you can figure out the kind of percentage of things that are included there. And you add those up to have the personnel total for this budget. While that's going to be one of the largest pieces of the budget, it is hopefully a fairly straightforward one to kind of estimate cost-wise. Non-personnel expenses. It's basically everything else. Now, all projects are different, so all budgets are going to look a little different. This is a sample here of non-personnel costs. It can be kind of a good list to start with to look at the kinds of general categories that non-personnel costs can fall into. Often, budgets can include costs for consultants or independent contractors. You include these after your regular salary costs, and you don't generally apply a benefit rate. Consultants are usually not offered fringe benefits from organizations. If your organization does, that is very, very kind of unique. So generally, that is just going to be a salary cost, and it is going to go here since they are not staff. They're brought in kind of independently for the specific project usually. Now, if you have volunteers, we will be discussing that in a little bit in a different part of this. So hold on to those thoughts. So after dealing with all of the people who might be working on the project, except our volunteers, because we mentioned, going to discuss that a little later, think of all possible expenses that could have an estimated dollar value. Try to think of as many of them as you can. If you have a line item for travel, that can include gas, mileage, airplane tickets, hotels, anything kind of related to that. Are you serving any kind of snacks at programs? Are you going to be renting any kind of specific equipment? Are you doing any printing? Are you mailing anything? There are going to be things here that you are buying specifically for this project, using entirely specifically for the project. You're going to think of all of them, try to find those estimates on things, as we mentioned a little bit ago, and use one of them to add it all up and have all of your non-personnel costs. Right, so now that we've talked about all of the expenses side of things, we will review just shortly here. Well, sorry, not all of them. You add the personnel, you add your non-personnel, and those are your direct costs. Sorry, we have gone over our direct costs. Now, you do also need a line for indirect costs. This is a part that can be fraught. So what do we mean when we say indirect costs? They are often considered the cost of doing business, costs not directly attributable to the project, but necessary to sustain it. So if your organization closes its doors, clearly you can't run the project. Yeah, so they are also called sometimes administrative costs, overhead costs, supportive services, operating costs, hidden costs, because they're the ones people don't really want to think about, or the ones that aren't showy or aren't directly related to the project. So we're talking things like rent, utilities, office supplies, your marketing budget, administrative staff, fundraising costs, all of these sorts of things. Now, so hidden costs, we kind of the way to talk about it when you're talking about how they are supporting a project where you see the project but don't really see all of the work going on behind the scenes. Hidden costs are what keep your organization running. Now, some grant makers don't fund indirect costs. That has been a big conversation in the nonprofit sector for many, many years. Some of them feel that they only want to fund things that they see the direct impact of. So there have been, especially from philanthropy support organizations like Forefront, other kinds of associations and things, there's been a lot of trying to raise awareness of those, the kind of simple answer that the direct impact doesn't happen if the organization doesn't get to keep running. Other grant makers who do fund indirect costs sometimes put specific limits on how much they're going to fund. They might only allow a specific percentage of overhead costs. Now, of course, when you are submitting a grant application, when you are writing a proposal, make sure to follow the grant maker's guidelines. If they say they don't fund indirect costs, then that is not a thing you can, ask them for funding for. So Michelle asks, when's it better to list fundraising staff salaries through overhead versus personnel? The grant writers doing the reporting for the funder. So that is probably going to be one where it can be a little tricky to talk about what is directly related to the project. So if it is a person who part of their job will be directly related to this project, then it is something that can usually be claimed through personnel. So that is not going to be, the entirety of their job, but if they have a piece of their job that is specifically related to this project, then that should be something that you can claim in the personnel costs as opposed to overhead costs. Also had a question, Sean, asking what's a good overhead percentage rate. So that again varies a little bit funder to funder. You can find numerous articles out there that will float different percentages. That 15 to 20 or around 20 gets floated a lot, trying to figure out what true costs are, because a lot of organizations try to downplay or minimize their costs because funders have for a very long time not wanted to fund some of those things. And you get the general public who doesn't like things that they see as not being directly related to these direct impacts as well. So can often be a little tricky to find out what the indirect cost rate should be, just because there is a huge culture in many ways of trying to hide or minimize these things. So look at the funder that you are considering, applying to, see what they are, see if they have any kinds of limits on those. Make sure you take those into consideration when you're applying to them. But if there isn't a specific kind of number or rate listed, be honest. Just try to see what that rate is going to end up being. So if you're looking at calculating your indirect rate cost, this again, a little bit like the fringe benefit rate, is something that can be done at an organizational level as well. If you are going to do it that way, then you would look at all of your programs and you would add up all of the direct costs for all of your programs. and see how much all of their costs are. Then you would basically add up everything else for your organization and see what that is. So with our thankfully very round number example here, we have an organization who has 2 major projects. They add up to $500,000 between the 2 of them. And then everything else the organization does costs $100,000. You then get, when you divide your indirect costs by your direct costs, a rate of 20%. So that is how that can be done, so that you don't have to try to reinvent the wheel and do that every single time. You can often think of that on kind of a cycle or a cyclic basis where you're looking at your projects as they change for your organization. But that is something where you can do that kind of on an organizational level so that you don't have to try to redo it every single time you are looking at a project budget. Right. So that is our cost side of things. That is the cost, the expenses. So we are going to switch gears and consider the other half, the other column in this, income. I'm also going to pause here for a second in case anybody else has questions they want to throw out, and because I need to take a drink of water. All right, so Lindsay has a question. We're considering providing operations-based grants rather than project-based grants. Do we have information or training on providing budget and financial information, how that may differ between requests being submitted projects? So I am not aware of a training that would be specifically on collecting financial information for operations-based grants. But I know that I've looked up information for people on these types of things on doing more kind of general support grants as opposed to project-based grants. So if you wanted to contact the library via email, that is something I can definitely go into, probably better in kind of a one-on-one sort of way that way, just so I don't get totally off track here. That is also a very good thing to note. While this particular
That's really enough.
I know. Steven just texted me. Do you want to put a notice that you're solving? Yeah, me too.
while this set of slides and this training are focused on project-based things, that is fortunately an area that one of the slightly bright sides of some of the emergencies and conversations over the last couple of years that have borne fruit from much longer conversations about having general support grants. So those do exist. There are more and more funders who are considering or offering them, and those do look a little different than things that are based on a specific project. We are, however, today focused on ones that are kind of on that project side of things. But it is a good reminder that general operations ones do exist, and that is hopefully becoming a more common sort of thing to be able to find. All right. So the moment we are going to now discuss the income side of things. First, we'll just check back in with our list of all of the components of a budget. We talked about expenses, so now we're going to talk about income. Income is both support and revenue. Support, any kind of contribution for your project, whereas revenue is generally earned income. All right, so our little sample table on showing income. Just as you laid out expenses for your project, you'll also show income as well. And all projects are different. This is just an example of how you can show your income. You may not, and almost certainly probably not in some projects are going to be receiving all of these types of income, and that is fine. You just need to list what applies to the specific project organization. That is one thing for general support. With a lot of these, while we're focused on projects today, with the exception of doing that kind of personnel cost where we're prorating things, when you're doing budgets for a whole organization, you can think of a lot of these in terms of the entire organization support as opposed to a specific project. So looking at grants and contributions, any contribution you have received from any kind of government organization, foundations, corporate grants, here you'll only be listing confirmed grants, not pending requests. Some grant makers may ask for pending requests as kind of a separate document. And if you do include it, typically that will be outlined or listed as kind of a separate attachment, or at least a separate page. You might, that might be a thing where if you have several pending requests that you think are very likely, or that you want to kind of make sure you're showing a potential funder that you are, that you have multiple kind of funding streams in mind, you might still want to include it. But since it's not confirmed, that will be kind of a separate, here are pending grant requests, rather than listing it here as actual income. So you're going to list those generally kind of separately, or at least, by small gradation here. With support from individual donors, you do also, of course, list that. You do not need to list all individuals. You can just add up the whole amount you receive from individual donors to list it here as one total. And of course, any support you receive from giving programs like the United Way, Combined Federal Campaign, anything else that is a different type of giving program. Now, earned income. So earned income can include fees for services, the sales of goods. This can be tickets to an event. It can be the sale of publications or anything. If you're, selling T-shirts, if you have any kind of product that is going to be going to go to this. Entrance fees if you're a museum, fees you charge for tours or other kinds of things there. Here at Forefront, some of our classes have a fee associated with them. So that would be something that we would list if we were looking at things about our whole organization, would be the fees paid for our classes. If you charge any kind of membership fee or due, you'll want to include that in your income as well. In-kind support. So in-kind donations are anything, any kind of gift that is not monetary in nature. Now, the first thing a lot of people think of for in-kind donations are goods, equipment, products, other kinds of things, stuff. In-kind contributions, though, can also be pro bono services, volunteers, space, anything like that. I believe we had a question, so let's see what that was. Your organization has sufficient general operating funds to cover a project, but not funds specifically earmarked to that project. How would you recommend reflecting that in the income? That is a very interesting question. That might be a way, if this is related to kind of general operating grants, it might be one where you might prorate it the same way we were looking at personnel costs earlier, where you might say that we're willing to basically consider committing this percentage of these general operating funds to this particular project. that is one where you might also definitely want to float that kind of question by someone who is a bit more of an expert in accounting things. That would be the kind of area I would think that might go into there. If you're doing something project-based and you want to kind of reflect that you've received general operating funds that can go in part to it, again, kind of doing on that prorating, like when we were talking about salaries, where you were talking about, if the ED is going to spend 10% of their time, you only claim 10% of their salary on the project budget. So that would probably be the kind of thing I would think would go best for reflecting that kind of income. That can also be one where you would also want to reflect it narratively. While we're kind of going over the numbers and the actual, chart type part of the budget, you will frequently have kind of a brief narrative to go through these costs. And that might also be one where you would make sure to include that kind of detail in the brief budget narrative to make sure that you are outlining that point. Right. So back to our in-kind contributions. So if you receive in-kind support, we'll say, for an example, donated space for your program, you are actually going to show it on both sides, in both columns, both as an expense and as income. Now, you might wonder why you're going to include it on both sides, since that basically negates it, costing anything. Because even though you're receiving the space for free, it is still an expense of the program. It needs to be reflected as such. They're balancing each other out. But if you don't include this kind of contribution as both an expense and income, then your budget isn't reflecting the true value of your project. And it might also, to someone who is looking at it as a reflection of your proposal narrative, might stand out to them as something that perhaps you haven't thought of. If they're reading your narrative about this project and it's talking about the space you're using, and then your budget doesn't mention the cost of the space anywhere, they might see that as a flaw where it's something you totally have covered. So you definitely want to list it both as an expense, as what it would have cost if you did have to rent that space, and then on your income as in-kind contribution, where you will reflect that it is paid for because it was donated. If your project includes volunteers, you can also include information from Independent Sector's website. And I'm actually going to see, I think I have, yes, that website handy. If you're going to be, including volunteers, folks at Independent Sector collect the kind of national dollar value rate for volunteer time. So you can also say what your volunteer's time is worth. There's also a map that can break down the dollar value for each state. Current national value is $28.54 an hour. That is as of April of this year. I believe Illinois is a little higher than that. I think we're on the high end of the side of the scale. But if you were using the national rate and you had a volunteer that spent 10 hours on your project, you can put them in your budget under income and expense as $285.40. So that is why we're talking about volunteers at this point with our in-kind contributions as opposed to simply personnel. It's because with a volunteer who is unpaid, you are showing them both as a cost because they are personnel working on the project, and that's what their time is worth. But since they are volunteering, essentially donating it, you'll also show it as income where that is being donated, that value of time is coming in from them. Okay. So if you happen to be over the border in Indiana or anywhere else, you can also look up specific states on Independent Sector's website if you wanted to use a state value as well. Right, so in-kind contributions are often going to show both sides, where you're going to show what they would have cost if you needed to pay for them and they hadn't been donated, and then also show them as income where they were donated. All right, so we are starting to wrap up this. We've gone over the kind of broad pieces that go on each side of a project budget, your incomes and your expenses. But we do have a few more kind of tips to go over about other things that may be important for some of this financial information. In addition to the project budget itself, there are other financial documents a grant maker might ask you for. Frequently, you can see things like recently audited financial statements, organization-wide budgets for recent years, list of supporters and other funding sources, annual report, budget narrative. I mentioned that a little earlier. That's a description that accompanies the budget. It might be used to clarify specific line items, explain how costs are estimated. They might want your 990. So again, as we say in basically anything where we're talking about grants, grant applications, make sure you include everything that is asked for and very little that is not. If you don't have something that is required, see if you can contact other organizations, see if there's a substitute that is acceptable. You know, if they're asking for a financial audit, which can be an expensive thing for a new or struggling or small nonprofit, see if you can contact, a program officer or someone and see if they'll accept a financial review instead, which is less expensive, or other kinds of, financial information. See what it is what the knowledge is they're really wanting out of that piece, and see if there's something you can substitute in if what is being asked for creates a burden. I've mentioned a few times there are ongoing conversations. That is, of course, another one where proposal requirements are a thing that streamlining of them is something that has been a very requested kind of item on the nonprofit side, is one that there is a lot of discussion about on the foundation side of what does the foundation actually really want to know and how to make that process as not burdensome on nonprofits as possible. Now, this process for some of these additional documents can be a little easier if you keep all of them in one place so that you have them easily accessible. Some people apparently still recall this a document drawer, which might be more of a document folder at this point in time, since that's probably going to be on a computer where you're keeping documents at this point. Point is, you have them all in place. You have them ready to attach or print out when you need them for submitting your proposal. You can have them saved as PDFs. You may also actually want to keep hard copies. And of course, make sure you always have the most up-to-date version on hand. All right, so some considerations after you've received your grant. So we're going to assume for a second your project was funded. Congratulations, proposal was accepted. You are, however, not done with your budget yet. So your budget is something that's going to be considered throughout the grant period. It becomes an essential project management tool as you implement your project. You're going to want to observe and monitor how the grant money is being spent and see how well it does line up with your estimates. Since some of those will have been quotes or estimates, there might be things that change. Now, you are going to be reporting back to the grant maker during and or after the grant period's ended. They're probably going to want to know what actual costs were versus projected costs. They might want a comparison between what you submitted with the initial proposal and what you actually spent. Sometimes they'll ask that you explain any significant variances to see what was going on there. This is another reason, like when we talk about the general proposal process, if you're accepted, make sure you have an ongoing conversation with the funder. Let them know about any kinds of developments, because if you are keeping them regularly informed about developments with the project, it makes it easier to talk about or explain or mention when something has become difficult or gone wrong. An example we're aware of, an organization who had a community garden that was being funded, and they had, been doing little updates for the funder on, we have planted, we've, did this, we had our, first bit of harvest. When a very large storm hit, it was very easy to go, hey, something unforeseen and terrible has happened that has really impacted what we're able to do here. In that case, the funder was able to go, okay, we're actually going to extend grant period I don't remember if there was also additional funding, but there was at least a lot of understanding about, all right, well, this is clearly a very large setback. So that kind of communication, that kind of conversation makes it easier to talk about what the variances were and why they happened. All right, finally, our key takeaways. Make sure you know your project thoroughly. If you are not the person involved directly with the project, make sure you have them, giving feedback or giving info for writing this sort of document. Estimate all of your direct costs. Be realistic about how much it is actually going to cost to implement your project. Include your percentage for indirect costs. Estimate all possible income, including your in-kind contributions and your earned income. You might want to be a little conservative about some of these projections. That's one of the reasons we also say don't generally include pending requests, only things that you are sure of. All right, so that takes me to the end of now my script. So if anyone has additional questions, feel free to ask them now. As I mentioned a little earlier, for anyone who didn't catch it then, this is being recorded. I will hopefully send everyone an email a little later this week that will have a link to the recording as well as a link to the document that would have been the exercise everybody would have filled out along the way if you've been doing this in person. If you are associated with a forefront member organization, also always remember you can email the library to ask for remote research assistance. And on the screen now are the various ways to stay in contact with us. All right. Thank you everyone for attending. If nobody has questions, I will let everyone have an additional few minutes to be able to relax and go about their day. Again, thank you everyone for attending. If you're just wanting to hang back and ask a question, you can also feel free to do that.